Hey guys, it's like New Year. It's time for some new MysHistory episodes, and I hope your New Year was great. This is actually an episode that I had thought about doing in October and then decided to change all my formats, and so now it's like one MysHistory episode and then a couple of random fact videos, and that'll be for the foreseeable future. And if I get time, maybe something weird and random, like, I don't know, skincare. I don't know. I'm just I'm coming up on my busy season for my photography business because track is going to be starting soon, so I'm going to be filming a whole lot of videos to get them out there so that I can get carried through the track season, so that I'm not stressing about this and stressing about that and stressing about the videos for that and the videos for this and the videos for everything, and oh my gosh, and then it's too much, and then I'm like, oh, and I can't do anything, and I shut down. If you can relate, raise your hand. Anyway, today let's talk about Madame LaLaurie. 3 marriages, 7 children, and a torture chamber in her home. But who was Madame LaLaurie? This story takes place in 19th century New Orleans. But before we get there, we kind of have to go back to the beginning, because history. Madame LaLaurie was born Marie Delphine McCarty on March 19th, 1787, in then the Spanish-owned New Orleans, Louisiana, to Louis Barthélemy de McCarty and Marie Jeanne Larble. My French sucks. She was one of 5 children and the second generation to be born on the continent of America after her grandfather immigrated from Ireland sometime around 1730. Her parents were prominent in the European Creole community in New Orleans, and she had an uncle by marriage who was governor of the Spanish province of Louisiana and Florida from 1785 to 1791, and she had a cousin who was the mayor of New Orleans from 1815 to 1820. When she was 4, the Haitian Revolution would break out in 1791, making slaveholders in the southern U.S. as well as those in the Caribbean fear rebellion among the slaves. And then to add to that, one of her uncles had been murdered by his slaves in 1771. So this revolution would inspire the Mina conspiracy in 1791, the Point Coup conspiracy in 1794, and then 1811 German Coast uprising. So all of this would lead to an even harsher treatment of the slaves by their slaveholders to suppress any further insurrection. Started out cold and now it's getting warm, and I have a humidifier going, so if you hear gurgling, it's because of my humidifier, because it's really dry here, and then it's cold, and then it's hot, and maybe it's me and I'm old. Anyway, at the age of 13, Marie would marry Don Ramon de Lopez y Angula, who was a Caballero de la Royal de Carlos. It's a lot. The Spanish isn't much better. They got married on June 11th, 1800. He was a high-ranking Spanish royal officer at the St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans, which became a Spanish colony in the 1760s after Spain defeated France in the 7 Years' War. Ramon was a 35-year-old widower, having recently lost his wife on the voyage from Spain to Louisiana to start his new appointed position. However, Ramon seemed to have harbored ill feelings toward the Spanish crown and blamed them for the death of his wife. And he felt that they were sent over from Spain at the worst time, and had they waited 1 month, as he requested, he may not have lost his wife. Apparently, he opened up the importation of captives directly from Africa defying orders that Spain instituted, and this would anger Spain. There's also conjecture that he further irked the crown by marrying Delphine, Marie, without their permission, and this would lead to them moving him around the globe and removing him from his prominent position. Allegedly, Marie would write letters and visit the Queen on behalf of her husband, and he was pardoned and then appointed to the Spanish Council in New Orleans, now under the American administration. In early 1805, Ramon would board a ship in Bordeaux to make his way back to his pregnant wife, who was then in Havana. On January 11th, the ship hit a sandbar off the shore of Havana, and Ramon was killed. So Marie would give birth to a daughter named Marie Delphine Francisca Biora Lopez y Angulo de la Calendaria. So many words. Named in part after her now deceased husband's first wife. She would stay in Havana long enough to bury her husband, have her daughter baptized, and then would return to New Orleans. And it was upon her return that she would learn that it was no longer under Spanish or French rule, but now part of America after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 from the French, who in 1800 had regained ownership of Louisiana. So imagine the shock of being like 16 or 17, a widow and a mother, and returning to something absolutely brand new. History isn't really clear as to what year Delphine married her second husband. There is one record that says March 19th, 1807, but another says that they were married in 1808. So regardless of which year, she married a Frenchman who was also a widower, and his name was Jean-Paul Blanc. The wedding took place a few weeks after the death of Delphine's mother, which would leave Delphine with an inheritance of $33,007 after being split among her mother's 3 children. This would make a nice dowry for her and her new marriage to Jean, who was a banker, lawyer, and legislator, and almost as affluent in the community as Delphine's family. Jean was a ruthless businessman, active in the slave trade and politics. He was also an associate to the pirate brothers Jean and Pierre Lafayette. Also included in Delphine's inheritance, her mother left her a downtown plantation on the bank of the Mississippi River, 52 slaves, as well as livestock and farm equipment. Her father would gift her and her new husband another plantation, property on Carter's Street, and an additional 26 slaves. So, all in all, this would be worth over $2 million today, which is really quite impressive. Jean would purchase a 2-story townhome on Royal and Conti next to the Bank of Louisiana, and he was the director of it. The couple would go on to have 4 children of their own, 3 girls named Marie Louise Pauline, Louise Marie Laure, and Marie Louise Jeanne. And then they would have a son named Jean-Pierre Paulin. In January 1815, the Battle of New Orleans would be fought between the British Army and the U.S. Less than a year after the war, Jean would pass away and leave Delphine once again a widow, this time with 5 children.
That sucks.
She was 28 and had to settle her late husband's estate, which consisted of debts totaling over $160,000, or over $2.5 million today. In 1816, she would renounce the couple's community property to the courts forfeit all of their mutual assets to pay the debts, and to protect and keep her personal property and assets. She would spend the next 10 years auctioning off as much of Jean's property, including his slaves. But she would purchase one piece of his property for herself at an auction and retain some of his slaves as well. Interesting to note, 8 of the slaves she now owned died in a span of 5 years, most being children or women of childbirthing age. What caused their deaths? It's unknown. So Delphine was pretty shrewd, and her late husband's death did not leave her completely depleted. Also, her father would pass away in 1824 and leave his children with a substantial inheritance. This would allow Delphine to return to solid financial footing and be quite wealthy. In 1825, Dr. Louis LaLaurie would arrive from France to start a practice of destroying hunches, or chiropractic as we know it today. In 1826, one of Delphine's children would need some help being straightened out, and a romance would begin. Delphine was 38, twice widowed, had 5 children, was wealthy. Dr. LaLaurie was 22. There were rumors about the budding romance between the two, but one thing that was for sure was the fact that the two had a child out of wedlock. Somebody must inform the church elders. That was because it's a big scandal at the time. Huge. Woo. Their son, Jean-Louis LaLaurie, was born August 13th, 1827, and the couple would marry 5 months later. But here's where things get a little cloudy about the relationship between the two. Between 1825 and 1827, Louis would receive several letters from his father urging him to get himself established in the medical field, marry a rich girl, and return to France. He did make references to Madame Blanc in his letters to his son, but it's believed that he thought Delphine could help her son advance his career. It's doubted he saw her as a potential daughter-in-law. Some say that Louis was inconspicuous, a colorless non-entity, or a meek and mousy little man. Apparently, Delphine did not think so. And if she did, perhaps it worked out better for her, because no one likes to be lonely. The day of their wedding was January 12th, 1828, but they would roll the date back 6 months to avoid the scandal of having a child out of wedlock. Delphine would enact a contract stating that she would retain control over her personal property, real estate, and slaves, then worth $67,000, with her new husband bringing only $2,000 into the marriage, which was actually tied up in the estate of his deceased mother. Who chased whom is not really known. Delphine had been a widow for 10 years by the time that she met Louis. Did she suddenly develop a fancy for much younger men, or was he the one that pursued her at the urging of his father? Whatever the case, it has been recorded that the marriage was not really a happy one, as the couple was known to fight, often separate, and then return to each other. Passion. There are also some letters that made early mention of Delphine's cruelty to her slaves. Some say she took her frustrations of her marriage out on her slaves. Delphine would purchase the lots on Royal and Hospital, which is now Governor Nicholas, in 1831. Even her new lavish home at 1140 Royal Street in the French Quarter did not make the marriage a happy one. And on November 16th, 1832, Delphine would petition the courts for a separation from the bed and board of her husband. In her petition, she would claim that Louis, quote, treated her in such a manner as to render their living together insupportable, along with claims that he had beaten her in front of witnesses. 5 months later, Louis would give up and move out of the home in the French Quarter to his new residence in this parish. It was around this time that rumors would start to circulate about how Delphine treated her slaves, which was cruel. At the time in New Orleans, they had laws, unlike most southern states, that protected slaves from unusually cruel punishments. Some of the stories of Delphine's cruelty would be that she kept her 70-year-old cook chained to the stove and starving, that she kept secret slaves so that her husband could practice Haitian voodoo medicine on them. Her cruelty extended even to her own daughters, who faced severe whipping if they tried to help any of the slaves at all. One slave was so afraid of punishment from Madame, he threw himself from a 3rd-story window to his death rather than face her torture. That window would be cemented shut after his death. There's another account that a young 12-year-old slave girl, Leah, one time while brushing Delphine's hair, pulled too hard, caused Delphine to fly into a rage, and like the slave before her, Leah would climb out onto the roof of the home and jump to her death. Witnesses would claim to have seen Delphine bury the girl's body on the property, and the police would fine Delphine $300 and also make her sell 9 of her slaves, which she would sell to family, and then the slaves would be returned to her, and the police seemingly just kind of looked the other way because I guess it pays to have money and be influential or whatever. This would be the beginning of Madame LaLaurie's social status beginning to change, as other socialites weren't interested in participating in social events nor interact with the LaLaurie family. According to funeral registries from 1830 to 1834, 12 slaves were said to have died at the Royal Street mansion, but the causes of death were unknown. The deaths would include a cook, a laundress named Bonne, and her 4 children. Other court records showed that Delphine freed 2 of her slaves, Jean-Louis in 1819, and another simply called de Vince in 1832. So now is when things get a little confusing, because there are some reports that say Jean-Louis was at the home on Royal Street on April 10th, 1834, when a fire broke out. And there are other reports that say that he was not there. But regardless of which report is accurate, there was a fire that broke out on April 10th, and this would expose some ugly truths about what was happening inside the mansion at 1140 Royal Street. Apparently, the fire started in the kitchen, and when the fire marshals arrived, they found the cook chained to the stove by her ankle. According to records, the cook said she started the fire so that she could commit suicide due to her fear of punishment by Delphine. The cook would further say that slaves would be taken to the uppermost rooms, never to be seen again. As with many of these older stories, some would be embellished as time went by. Judge Jacques Francois Canoge was a neighbor to the LaLauries, and he would be among the first to arrive at the fire. He and other first responders would help the LaLauries transfer the valuables to safekeeping in other areas of the mansion in the event that the fire started to spread. There would be some that would tell the judge about the slaves, and this would lead him to ask for permission to have the slaves removed and taken to safety. So the rumor is he asked the good doctor, and the doctor is reported to having said, there are those who would do better employed if they would attend to their own affairs instead of officially intermingling with the concerns of other people. Excuse me? It's just like the weirdest thing to say. Mind your business. There are people in there. So this did not stop the judge. He would give orders to break down the doors to rescue the slaves. And this is when the secrets behind the walls would see the light of day. But it was something apparently nobody was prepared for. Sources vary as to how gruesome it was. The sight would have the mob shift, and they would actually begin to destroy the contents of the mansion, thinking it was no different from the way the LaLauries treated their slaves. Some of the reports were that slaves were horribly mutilated. Some were allegedly suspended by their neck and their extremities stretched and torn. Some of the slaves had been imprisoned that way for months. The judge, along with a few citizens, would discover 2 slave women that they liberated. One was wearing an iron collar and was chained with heavy irons by the feet. The judge would question Dr. LaLaurie and was reportedly told, some people had better stay at home rather than come to others' houses to dictate laws and meddle with other people's business. Other reports were that the slaves were emaciated, showed signs of being flayed open with a whip, bound in restrictive postures, wore spiked iron collars, keeping their heads in static positions. Slaves were beaten, bruised, and bloodied to within an inch of their lives. Their eyes were gouged out, mouths filled with excrement and sewn shut, and one most disturbing report said that there was a woman whose bones had been broken and reset so that she resembled a crab. And another woman was wrapped in human intestines. Other witnesses would also claim that there were people with holes in their skulls with wooden spoons nearby that were used to stir their brains. Yeah, House of Horrors for sure. I don't understand how you can be so cruel, so awful to people. Like I said, I guess I get the benefit of history. But still, there were laws in New Orleans at that time that this was not something that was acceptable, and there were more protections for slaves in New Orleans, as I understand it, than there were in other parts of slave-holding states. So, several weeks after the fire, the New Orleans Advertiser would state that 2 of the slaves found in the mansion had since died, stating, "We understand that in digging the yard, bodies have been disinterred and the condemned well. Having been uncovered, others, particularly that of a child, were found." So it wasn't just 12-year-old Leah that was buried, apparently, in the mansion grounds. It was other slaves as well. They just sound like awful people. Delphine did have one loyal servant left, though, on her staff. And amid the chaos and flames, the servant would bring a carriage round with Delphine stepping into it to escape. The mob would notice this, and while initially stunned at this brazen attempt, some would try to hold the horses, and others would try to rip them from the carriage. It was all in vain, as the coachman used his whip and would plunge the horses forward through the crowd. He would deliver Delphine to a schooner waiting at the docks on Lake Pontchartrain, which she boarded and fled New Orleans. There are rumors that Delphine spent time in Mobile, Alabama, prior to heading for New York, where she was to travel to France with her husband. The two did allegedly make it to Paris, where Delphine's children would stay for extended times. And Louis would live off of her wealth. But apparently, he got tired of her complaining, and he left her in Paris, and he went to Havana. Her children would eventually move to Paris, and then they would live in homes in the first, Delphine would never answer for her crimes and would die in Paris on December 7th, 1849, of unknown causes. So the mansion does still stand today in the French Quarter, and it is rumored that it is haunted by the slaves that died under Delphine's cruelty, as well as by Delphine herself. Have you heard of this case? What do you think? Let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments about all of this. And while you're down there, hey, don't forget to, like the video, hit the subscribe button, and we'll have more Miss History next month, and we'll have some random facts and maybe some other random videos. But until then, be good people to each other. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.